Welcome to the Australian Business Executive Podcast, where we speak with Australia's most influential industry professionals on the business and economic development issues taking place across the country. You can stay up to date with all our content, including our magazines, podcasts and videos by visiting www.theabe.com.au and clicking on subscribe.
Paul Innes was appointed Secretary of the New South Wales Jockeys Association in 1998. His role at the association was to primarily improve the welfare and conditions for jockeys across the state. Around 2001, it became clear there was a need for a peak national body to be formed to look after the interest of jockeys across the country. And in 2002, representatives from all state associations met and agreed to establish the Australian Jockeys Association. Paul was appointed the inaugural chief executive of the organization, and in 2004, the Australian Jockeys Association established the National Jockeys Trust. The principal purpose of the trust is to relieve the immediate and ongoing financial needs of jockeys and their families, with Paul being appointed the inaugural chairman in 2004, a position which he still retains. Paul is a qualified accountant and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Paul, thanks for joining us today.
That's a pleasure.
So, for our audience who may be unfamiliar, could you provide a little bit of a background on the National Jockeys Trust?
Yes, the National Jockeys Trust was established by the Australian Jockeys Association in 2004 to provide support to jockeys and their families who may have been injured, permanently disabled or severely injured or ill, or tragically where there might have been a death of a jockey. The Trust could provide support services to those families and jockeys.
Okay. And, you're sort of already answering that, but, why was it necessary to create the Trust?
Yes, that's a good question. It was necessary. We at the Australian Jockeys Association, when we established the national body for jockeys, we realised that there wasn't proper support services, particularly financial services for jockeys who might have been seriously injured in the industry. And I think largely we felt that the industry itself did not provide enough services to our members and jockeys generally. So it was felt that we should take on the responsibility, if you like, to establish the National Jockeys Trust to do this. I can give you an example specifically why this was needed. I can tell you that in certain circumstances, prior to the trust being established, certain high-profile riders might have been provided with significant assistance through large fundraising functions, whereas a country jockey, little-known jockey, that there might have been a chook raffle at the local pub, and we just thought that was unfair and not equitable, and that was the catalyst, if you like, for us to establish a national trust to make it more fair and equitable for those injured or ill in this industry.
Now, that's quite interesting because we had the chance to initially speak, before we're doing this podcast, and you had mentioned to me some of the dangers associated with the sport. Can you, just provide a little bit of the facts and figures around racing?
Yes, certainly. This industry, as far as being a jockey, is the most dangerous occupation in this country, and that's according to the Menzies Institute. We know that jockeys are injured at a fairly significant rate on an annual basis. There are approximately 830 professional jockeys in Australia, and of those, somewhere between 30 and 35% of those riders will have at least one injury that will stop them from riding, for any period of time, for a few days up to many months. Some of those riders will suffer permanent disabling injuries, and we can expect a couple of those a year. And tragically, we will also, on a yearly basis, probably average at least one death. So it's a very dangerous industry. We have built memorials in both at Randwick in Sydney and at Caulfield in Melbourne to those riders who have lost their lives. And for those that we know, there are 880 jockeys' names on those memorials, representing those that have lost their lives that we're aware of from our own research.
And is it, from the sport, are they typically, is it being thrown from the horse? Like, is this the most common cause of injury then, if I'm assuming that?
The most common cause would be from a horse fall, where one or multiple horses might fall in a race. It's not common, but it does occur. And in those circumstances, that's where a jockey is more likely to suffer a significant injury, and that might be spinal, paraplegia, quadriplegia, unfortunately, or even a death. But fortunately, even in falls, in most occasions, jockeys are able to get up and walk away. But the dangers are there on a daily basis for jockeys, and both they and their families are more than conscious of that, of course.
And could you give our listeners just an idea, like if a jockey is injured, the trust can help provide some support for them, but I assume, rehabilitation and support, these are ongoing and I assume not cheap costs to endure.
Well, that's correct. I should point out, first of all, that across the country, jockeys, whilst they are regarded as contractors from a general purpose or common law point of view, they are deemed employees of the race clubs for whom they ride on the day, and therefore there are benefits through workers' compensation. So that's a significant benefit to riders across the country. However, it's the more significant injuries and those injuries that bring about the end of a career, where we see the support services working particularly well now through the National Jockeys Trust to provide support, assistance with rehabilitation, although even at this stage it's somewhat limited in this country, but ongoing assistance through the trust with advice and support to the families, and of course in particular the financial assistance able to provide for long-term injured. And I also should point out that the trust is there not just for current riders, but we assist former riders who might have fallen on hard times as a result of injury or illness, and we've assisted many riders, former riders, in that way.
And can I ask, how would it differ from, if you look at major sports, sports would have like a players' association. Is there a riders' association, or how do you differ from?
Yes, well, that's exactly what the Australian Jockeys Association is. It's the Jockeys Association, and it was established in approximately 2002, when it was realised that the state associations for jockeys, the state member associations, were unable to provide the extent of services that we now have in place. And it was realised by myself and a couple of other of our colleagues that the only way to progress the benefits to riders was to establish a national body. And so that's our Players Association, as you say. It's the Australian Jockeys Association. As a consequence, in 2004, the Australian Jockeys Association established the National Jockeys Trust to provide these ongoing support services.
And how do you guys try to gain visibility? I mean, Australia it's a sports mad nation that's cluttered with different sports, and there's other sports that I assume take a lot of that slice of the pie. So how do you guys try to gain traction and create awareness of your message?
Yes, it's a very relevant point. I mean, we are sports mad here, and there are so many ways that people can participate in sports. And of course, this is a sport that involves gambling, and gambling, as you know, these days has taken on a multifaceted aspect in regards to online gambling and many other forms of gambling. So that one of the ways that we've been able to raise the profile to some extent is that we have an ongoing sponsorship arrangement currently with one of the big superannuation funds in Australia, Lucrative Super, and we're very grateful to Lucrative Super for its ongoing financial support of the trust. The way that is elevated, if you like, is that the jockeys ride with a pair of breeches that have on the breeches some annotation of the Lucrative Super logo. And in that way, we're able to explain to people that the logo, as part of the sponsorship deal, all the funds go to the trust to support seriously injured or ill jockeys. None of the funds go directly to jockeys. The jockeys more than happy to accept that the funds go into the trust to support their fellow riders in need.
And so, Paul, having been founded in 2004, the trust now seems quite mature on the process to being well established. How did you come into the organization?
Well, my background started with the association in 1998, 20 years ago now, when I was appointed the secretary of the state body in New South Wales, the New South Wales Jockeys Association, mainly to take on the role to improve welfare and conditions in New South Wales. And my background is in accounting. Also, therefore, my role included looking after the books of account, conducting meetings of members, including the annual general meeting. But it was around about 2000, 2001 that it was realised by myself and a couple of other people that the only way to progress the benefits to jockeys in this country was to have a national body, and that's why we went about establishing the Australian Jockeys Association in about 2002.
Are there any particular, you're not the first person that I've talked to about sort of a federated association with having organizational issues when it's state-based. Were there particular problems when each state was, had the flexibility to run itself?
Yes. One of the catalyst for the establishment of a national body was the significant increase in the cost of insurance for jockeys. Around about 2000, 2001, the cost of public liability insurance increased significantly for jockeys. And in fact, to such an extent that we lost a lot of jockeys from the industry who just could not afford the cost, particularly country riders, provincial riders who found that sort of cost prohibitive based on the income that they were receiving. So certainly a catalyst for establishing a national body was to see what we could do as an association to put together a national policy on insurance, which we ultimately did through one of the big brokers in Australia. And we established a national policy whereby jockeys were covered, not just for public liability insurance, but also personal accident. And subsequent to that date, we now have in place such policies that jockeys don't even need to pay directly for those costs. It's been paid for through an agreement within the industry that 1% of prize money is used to fund those costs on behalf of the riders. Otherwise, we would have kept losing significant numbers of riders from the industry.
It's an interesting thing that you've addressed because it is rather niche as an activity. How do riders come into the sport? I mean, it's not like playing AFL or rugby league where you just sign up and you've got a local sports ground. Is there a development pathway, and how do individuals find themselves getting into the sport?
Well, I think traditionally young people came into the sport, particularly in the country areas, the love of horses, pony clubs, that sort of thing. The industry is big and far and wide as far as, we're a horse-loving country, and we have been since the first fleet arrived here. And the number of horses, not just thoroughbreds, but ponies and other sorts of horses across the country has generated a significant interest for young people to become involved. And, of course, there are stables and tracks right across every state, across most country towns and centres throughout the country, and young people have got interested in riding horses at tracks, becoming apprenticed or just being stable hands and track riders. So there's been that feeder, if you like, from country areas in particular, through to metropolitan areas when those who have shown particular skills have been apprenticed to various trainers and go through their apprenticeship, ultimately, hopefully, without significant weight problems and becoming senior riders. But that has changed a little bit in more recent years. The problem we have is, like in most countries, we're all getting heavier, and young people are no different. And being able to get young people coming in who can maintain the required minimum weight is a difficulty. And that is one of the reasons why we're seeing more female riders come into the industry over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, there would have been a handful of female riders probably across the country. Now it would be in the vicinity of about 27% of jockeys are female. And that's a worldwide trend as well. And I think weight's got a lot to do with that. So there have been some dynamics and anomalies happening throughout the industry over the last few years that's seen that change.
It's a good and interesting point that you've raised, because my next question was going to be, where does the National Jockeys Trust see itself headed into the future as an organisation?
Yeah, I think up to date we've concentrated on providing immediate and meaningful assistance to jockeys in need as a result of injury or illness. That's been our mission. But in the future, we would like the Trust to concentrate, establish relationships with rehabilitation centres, for example, similar to what's occurred in the UK. The Injured Jockey Fund in the UK has 2 rehabilitation centres now, one in the north, in North Yorkshire, and another one in Newbury in Berkshire. And they are providing support services for physiotherapy, hydropool treatments of jockeys who have spinal injuries, maybe brain injuries, or even not so significant injuries, but injuries that are keeping a rider out, knees or backs or whatever. We see, the trustees believe that that is a direction that we would like to go. Because Australia is so big in geographically in comparison to the UK, though, it's difficult to have those sort of centres because of the size of the country. So we would probably like to partner with various rehab centres around the country, whereby we're able to perhaps inject funds to work in partnership with those rehab places to provide services to our members who are suffering certain injuries that they can benefit from going to those centres. And another area I should point out is that in the UK, the Injured Jockey Fund there has a group of almoners who contact and visit injured or ill riders across the country, across Great Britain, England in particular. And we at the Trust, the trustees believe that would be something we would like to introduce. We'd like to have half a dozen or so people who can make contact with the injured, those that financially, but see how they're handling their illness or their injury, and provide whatever support that can be provided to those people ongoing until they recover, hopefully, from those injuries or illness. So we see a progression from the basic benefits that we're able to provide in the future.
And you're talking about the critical work and support that you provide for jockeys, but in terms of taking this message out to the public or creating awareness, is there a particular issue that you wish was better articulated to get your message across? Well,
yes, I think it's probably, even for race goers, let alone people who don't follow the industry all that closely, it's probably difficult for them, even the race goers, to understand the dangers of being a jockey. There are jockeys can suffer very significant injuries, and it may not be apparent to the wider public about this. For example, an average jockey is about 53 kilograms. They ride a thoroughbred racehorse of some 550 kilograms in weight at approximately 45 kilometres an hour in a field of 12 to 16 horses on an average. So there's not much margin for error when it comes to incidents or accidents and what can occur as a result of those incidents. And I think it's just, whilst people may not take a particular interest in gambling, I think it's worth remembering the courage of these young men and women predominantly who take the risk every day to keep an industry going, because without jockeys there's no industry. And only 830 licensed riders across the country keep this mammoth industry ticking over on a daily basis.
Paul, I think that's a really good place to wind it up today. I appreciate your time in speaking to us.
Not at all.
This has been a production of the Australian Business Executive, a division of Romulus Rising Proprietary Limited. All rights reserved. You can stay up to date with the Australian Business Executive, including our magazines, podcasts and videos, by visiting www.theabe.com.au and clicking on subscribe.